This is part 2 of the Black Eyed Susan. If you haven't seen part 1, you can check out my YouTube channel, Melinda Calway, and you will be able to check this out. Now, part 2 is the background. The background's always a little trickier because you have to figure out what's going to make the Black Eyed Susan stand out. And I want it to be background, so I do not want it to be vibrant. My first thought is complementary color. So I'm going to go to violet, which is the complementary color to the yellow. And I don't want it to be too vibrant though, so this violet here is quinacridone violet, which is a really bright red, and it will definitely compete with the flowers. So I'm going to mute it down. I'm going to throw a little bit of the blue in it, which is ultramarine blue, and just whatever colors happen to be in here. Knock it down a few notches. I want it to be more of a grade violet. So let's just throw some other colors in. Throw a little bit of green in, because it has a lot of red in there, so that'll bring it down a little bit. Okay, so that's a good start. And I need to figure out, do I want my background to be lighter or darker? And because the yellow is such a light color, it'll probably end up being a little bit darker. And I'm going to throw in some more ultramarine. Now, I don't want it to necessarily be the same color everywhere. That would just be boring. So I'm going to mix up a few different colors. And notice I didn't really even clean my palette from before, so that I can just go right over everything. Okay, so I've got some violet, I've got some kind of a bluey color here. And I'm going to throw in, of course, some colors that are in the actual subject, which will be some yellows and things. And the brush that I'm using here to mix my colors is a kind of a cheapo flat brush with quite long bristles. I found that using my nice pointy brushes to mix, it kind of sands off the tip and I lose the tip. So I'm trying to remember to use this brush when I do my mixing. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of raw sienna here. Get a little bit of this beautiful Hansa Yellow Deep. Might throw some of that in after, just to unify the whole thing. And I'm going to have to wet it. Now, only where I wet, the paint will go. But there's a lot of little grooves, ins and outs that I have to wet. So the wetting's going to take a bit of time. But I want my color to be fairly ready to go once I've got the water where I want it on my picture. So the mixing of the color often takes a lot longer than the actual painting part. This is some green here. I'm just going to throw some green in. I like putting lots of colors in. And the hardest part is knowing, am I going to have enough? Okay, so I'm going to wet it with a bit of a dirty brush so I can see where I put the water very easily, and so can you. So I'm using my mixing brush first to put the water on, because it's nice and big. Long bristles holds lots of water. So I'm going to start off in a big area. Now, if you're doing this at home, it might be better to start with a small area. You know what, let's do that. So I'm going to go around it carefully as I can with the big brush, and then I'll take a smaller brush and go into the spaces in between the petals. And you want to be very careful that on one side of the petal, the color is similar than on the other side. So I'm just going to keep this spot here good and wet. So we'll come back to that. We'll go back to use a number 4 here. It's a number 4 round, and go into the spaces. Now, if I get water on the petals, the background is going to go there. I could have used masking fluid and just masked very carefully around the petals, like masked right on top of the petals, but that's a lot of work and takes a lot of time, and I have to wait till it dries. And I still have to be really careful anyway, so I might as well try it this way. This is the trickiest part here, getting the wetting in between all the petals. Don't really have anything to rest my hand on. Would make it a little bit easier. I can try resting on the side here. Okay, lots of water there. Let's move it around. This part is actually more time consuming than adding the paint part, and a lot less fun. Put some water in that little spot there. Okay, going right to the edges. Keeping this part really wet. I'm going to go in this little spot here as well. And you could take your masking fluid and go all the way around on top of each petal if you wanted to make sure that you got it right. Okay, I'm going to go back to my large brush again for a sec. And now let's start throwing some colors in. Notice the colors are very muted. I don't want them to take your eye away from my subject. And I know it's going to dry at least 25% lighter. I've got lots of water on my background here. So, using the bigger brush to start with. And I do have a lot of pooling of water, which I don't particularly want, so let's lift that off with a less wet brush. So it's going to dry way lighter. Let's throw some more color together here to end up with a little bit of a darker outcome. I can see the colors starting to granulate already, which is quite nice. Again, keep this little spot wet. Taking my number 4 brush now and going in closer to the petals. The water should take it in the final little bit because it's already wet there. So the color's all fairly dark, but there is a bit of a difference in the color. It's not all exactly the same color. There's some green in there, there's some blue, there's a lot of kind of a browny violet. Do a little bit of yellow in there. Change it up a bit. Okay, the part that I did in between the petals has dried, unfortunately. So I have to be very careful. I can always come back to that later. This part's still wet, so I'm going to go in there. Still wet, the water does more of the work for you. So this part's not difficult, it's just fiddling. I just put a little bit into one of the petals. So I'll see if I can lift off with a clean brush. It might seep back in. I can go back in later and clean it up. I did a fairly large area at once. You can do a smaller area if you're trying this. You can just kind of do this. And how I'm keeping that part wet so that I won't have a hard line when I come back to that. So as long as whatever area you do, you keep the edges wet. Here I don't need to keep it wet because I have a hard line here. This petal is dividing it, so if it's not wet, that's okay. I'm going to leave that little white edge there. I quite like it. And here as well. Okay, so let's carry on. This is still fairly wet. I don't like this puddling there, so I'm going to lift it off, bring it down here a little. I didn't wet down there yet, but I will. Puddling here, bring this down here. I'm going to use the big brush again to do some wetting. Keep this part here wet too. So I'm wetting around the petals. Now in the composition, if you saw part one, you'll notice that I put this petal in after the fact. I just noticed that that flower needed a little bit more, so I put that petal in a little bit behind so that it was a little bit better balanced. Not that flowers often are balanced, but I have artistic license and I can use it and make the flower look the way I want it to look. That's what I did. Okay. Again, the trickiest part is going around the petals, around the stems. That's the most time-consuming part. Keep using the big brush as long as I can because it holds more paint and it's just a bit quicker. I have to switch to the smaller brush very shortly. And those are encased areas, so I can do those separately. Okay, switching to the smaller brush. There's a little bit of paint on that smaller brush, which is totally fine. So this part is the most fiddly. If you like, you can fast forward through this. In fact, if I knew where the pause button was, I would pause it for a while so that you don't have to watch me wetting all this detailed paper. But I'm fairly new at this videoing thing, so I'm not an expert yet, knowing where the pause buttons are, or how to slice it together, or things like that. But this is a start. That part's starting to dry up a little bit there. I want to spatter some color in, but it's still fairly wet, so I can wait. Okay, let's add some color to this. kind of went into the leaf a little bit there, sorry, the petal. Use the big brush when we can. I like to keep the corners a little bit darker because it keeps your eye in the picture, frames it nicely. Put a little bit of perylene green in the corners here. I'll move it around a bit. But you can have a wonderful picture of flowers, and if you don't do the background right, it doesn't make it stand out as much as it could. So that's always the tricky part to do, is to try to make a background so that it doesn't compete with your flowers. You want the flowers to stand out. They're the solo act. The background is just there to make them look good. Okay, I have to go to a smaller brush again. It's always hard to know how much paint to mix, and I am running out of paint. Tiny little brush here to try and get up in those little small areas. This is a 0. It's a round brush, a fairly short bristle so that I have lots of control. But you want the areas around the petals to be fairly rounded, fairly smooth. Keeping an eye on that top part, still fairly wet. As I mentioned, I want to spatter a little different colors onto that to change it up a bit. Maybe spatter a little water on it as well. Now the in-between parts, the contained parts there, I'll do them totally separately. I just have to make sure that whatever color is like on this side of the petal, it's going to be on that side of the petal. You can't have something really, really different on each side, or it starts to look like a stained glass. It doesn't look like it's unified. One of the things you always got to think about. This video is probably going on a little bit longer than it should, but these things do take time. This up here is starting to dry. I'm going to spatter a little bit. When I spatter, I'm taking a rigger. This is a 0 rigger, so it's nice and small. And I'm going to add some paint to it. And this is raw sienna. I'm just going to spatter a little bit on. I'm going to also put some of the the other yellow on here. This is the Hansa. See how it kind of blossoms a little bit because it's still fairly wet. And I'm going to take some of the darker color here and put some of that on too. Just covering up my flower a little bit so that I don't want to get the spatters necessarily on the flowers. This makes the background look a little more interesting without having to do a whole lot more work. You can also take some water and spatter it too. And the water, it does lighten up the background a little bit, but adds a little bit more texture. So this is kind of giving the illusion of texture. This is too dry to do that, but you kind of get the idea. Some darker blue in here with some violet too. So I'm just tapping the brush lightly and putting this in. So you've got all the ideas of what I'm going to do. I'm going to fill those spots in. I'm going to spatter down here too. To prevent this video from going on too much longer, I will post a picture of the finished project, but you have all the information that you need to do this now. If you wanted to put some spatters like in spots in here, you could just kind of touch the tip of the brush to it and then have a little bit more control. It's better to not have it evenly spaced, so keep that in mind when you're doing it. And any spatters that you want to blossom a little bit, you must do while the paint is still wet. If you want the spatters to be very fixed and small, then you may do it when it's dry. Okay, thank you. If you want to check out more of my paintings, you can check out melindacalway.ca or my website, that is my website, or my Facebook page at Melinda Calway-artist or Instagram melindacalway.art. Have a great day. Thank you.